So you're here because you love philosophy, and you're ready to get into some really deep stuff.
That's right, we're going deep. Today, we're diving into Kant's critique of metaphysics.
Specifically, how Kant kind of upended centuries of thought about metaphysics. Big stuff, right?
Oh, yeah, he's taking on those classic questions about the soul, the universe, God.
All the things that keep philosophers up at night, basically.
Exactly. We'll be using an excerpt from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy as our guide.
If you're into philosophy, you know the Stanford Encyclopedia is the place to go for in-depth stuff.
Definitely. And even if you're not a philosophy expert, stick with us. We're going to break it down and make sure it makes sense.
That's right. But be warned, Kant's work is dense.
Yeah, it's definitely a workout for your brain.
But in a good way, I promise. So let's jump in. One of the most famous questions Kant asks, and it's a big one, is how are synthetic a priori propositions possible?
Yeah, that one's a real head scratcher.
It might sound like jargon, but it's actually the foundation for his whole critique of metaphysics.
Basically, what he's asking is, can we really know things about the universe that we haven't directly experienced?
That's what we're talking about when we say synthetic a priori propositions.
Right. These are statements that seem to give us new knowledge, not just rearranging things we already know, and we seem to know them without needing any evidence from experience.
Like, think about the statement, every event has a cause.
Right, that's a classic example. We kind of just assume it's true, right?
But where does that knowledge come from? Is it really true about the world, or is it just something our minds kind of impose on reality?
And that's exactly what Kant is trying to figure out. He's challenging that traditional view of metaphysics that assumed we could just use pure reason to access truths about the universe.
Like pure thought, no messy real-world observations needed, right?
Right. But Kant is arguing that our knowledge isn't just passively received from the world, it's actively shaped by the structure of our own minds.
Okay, so let me get this straight. If we can't know things in themselves, if our minds are always shaping what we know, doesn't that mean all knowledge is just a kind of opinion? How can we be sure we're actually grasping anything real?
That's the big question that Kant's work raises. And it leads us to one of his most important concepts: the difference between appearances and things in themselves.
Okay, hit me with it. What are appearances and things in themselves?
Well, think about a rainbow.
Okay, a rainbow.
We know it exists because we see it, right? The sunlight goes through the water droplets, our eyes pick up the colors.
Right, basic physics.
But what is the rainbow itself?
Apart from how our eyes see it.
Exactly. Is there a real rainbow out there that exists independent of us seeing it? That's the kind of thing Kant wants us to grapple with.
So appearances are things as we perceive them, filtered through our senses and our minds.
Exactly. And things in themselves, which Kant calls noumena, are the objects as they really are, independent of us.
And he's saying we can only really know those appearances, not the noumena.
Right. It's like we're watching a movie projected onto a screen. We can experience and analyze the movie.
But we can't reach out and touch the projector itself.
Exactly. That projector is like the realm of things in themselves, and according to Kant, it's just beyond our reach.
This is blowing my mind a little. So Kant is basically saying that all those traditional metaphysical concepts,
Yeah.
all those ideas that try to describe the soul, the universe, or God as they truly are basically off limits.
That's a good way to put it.
We're stuck with the movie. We can't know the ultimate reality behind it.
Precisely. That's transcendental idealism. That's the name of the game.
Transcendental idealism. Our knowledge is limited to how things appear to us because our minds shape how we see the world.
Exactly. It doesn't mean that the external world doesn't exist, just that we can only access it through our own perception.
Okay. So Kant is putting up some pretty strict boundaries for what we can really claim to know.
He is.
But he doesn't stop there, right? He also says our own reasoning about the world can lead us astray, which he calls transcendental illusion.
Right, and that's where things get even more interesting. We'll dive into that more after the break. Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about how our minds actually shape what we know. That's Kant's big idea of transcendental idealism.
Yeah, it's like we're trapped in our own heads, experiencing this world of appearances, but never really knowing the ultimate reality behind it all.
Exactly. And to see how this really plays out, let's look at how Kant applied this idea to some classic metaphysical topics, like the soul.
Okay, the soul. For centuries, philosophers have been trying to understand what the soul is using logic and reason to define it.
Right, like Descartes' famous, I think, therefore I am.
Yeah, trying to prove the soul exists just because we're aware of ourselves thinking.
Exactly. Traditional rational psychology assumed we could just use reason to figure out the soul's essence, its properties, maybe even prove it's immortal.
And Kant's saying this whole project is based on a mistake.
Well, he'd say they were misusing the tools of reason. Remember that key distinction between appearances and things in themselves?
Right, the movie versus the projector.
Exactly. He argues the soul, like the universe or God, isn't something we directly experience. It's not given in our senses.
So we can't observe it, can't measure it.
Right, we can't subject it to scientific study.
So it's like we're trying to use rules meant for understanding the physical world to describe something that's totally beyond that.
Exactly. Kant says when we do that, we fall into what he calls transcendental paralogisms.
Transcendental paralogisms. Sounds intense.
It's kind of like a logic trap. We try to use reason to prove something about the soul, but the argument itself is flawed.
Flawed how? Can you give us an example?
Sure, let's take the idea that the soul is simple, meaning it can't be divided.
Okay.
Some philosophers say the soul has to be simple because if it wasn't, we wouldn't have a unified self.
Makes sense?
But Kant would say, hold on, the concept of simplicity only makes sense for things we can experience, things in the world of appearances.
But the soul isn't like that. It's beyond our direct experience.
Exactly. So we can't apply the concept of simplicity to it.
It's like trying to describe what anger smells like. The categories just don't match up.
Precisely. Kant would say we're misusing the concept when we apply it to the soul. And this goes for other attempts to define the soul with pure reason, too.
We end up stuck in these pointless arguments that don't really tell us anything about the soul itself.
Right. Kant's not saying we don't have an inner experience of ourselves, a sense of self, but he says we can't use that to claim the soul is some kind of thing that exists independently of our perception.
Okay, so that's the soul. But what about the universe as a whole?
Ah, now things get even more interesting. Kant calls this rational cosmology.
Rational cosmology.
And it's here that our desire for ultimate explanations, remember we talked about that?
Right, we all want to know the why of everything.
Well, that desire, when applied to the cosmos, leads to some real contradictions.
Contradictions, like what?
Kant calls them antinomies. Basically, pairs of contradictory arguments about the universe, and reason seems to support both sides.
So reason gets tied in knots trying to figure out the whole universe.
Exactly.
Can you give me an example of one of these antinomies?
Sure. Take the question of whether the universe is finite or infinite.
Okay, finite or infinite?
We can argue the universe must have a beginning because an infinite chain of causes is impossible to imagine.
Right, something had to start it all off.
But we can also argue the universe can't have a beginning. Because then what caused that? What existed outside of time and space to make the universe begin?
So both possibilities seem impossible. We can't imagine a universe without a beginning, but we also can't imagine what could have caused it to begin.
Exactly. It's a real catch-22. And Kant identifies other antinomies, too, about the divisibility of matter, free will, all sorts of things.
So does Kant pick a side? Does he think the universe is finite or infinite, for example?
He doesn't pick a side in the traditional sense.
What does he do then?
He says both sides of each antinomy are wrong.
Both wrong. But they can't both be wrong.
He says they're wrong because they both start with the same false assumption. And that assumption is that the universe as a whole is something we can know, something we can grasp with our understanding.
Ah, so he's going back to that distinction between appearances and things in themselves.
Exactly. We're trying to use the tools meant for understanding the world of appearances, our everyday experience, and applying them to the universe as a whole, which is beyond our grasp.
So Kant's saying our knowledge is limited to what we can experience, and we shouldn't try to push those limits when talking about the universe as a whole.
Exactly. He's not taking sides in the debate. Instead, he's showing that the debate itself is based on a faulty premise.
Okay, so that's the soul, that's the universe, but we can't avoid the big one. God.
Right, God. What about rational theology, the attempt to prove God exists using reason?
How does Kant's critique apply there?
That's a really important question, and it leads us to one of the most fascinating and controversial parts of Kant's philosophy. He rejects the idea that we can know God through pure reason.
But he doesn't just throw out the idea of God completely.
Right. It's a really subtle position that we need to unpack carefully, and that's exactly what we'll be doing in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, and we've been exploring some pretty mind-blowing stuff about Kant's critique of metaphysics.
Yeah.
How he's basically saying we can't really know those big things, the soul, the universe as a whole, God, at least not in the way philosophers traditionally thought we could.
Right. Kant's really shaking things up. But as we've seen, he doesn't just tear down old ideas. He gives us a whole new way to think about the power and the limits of human reason.
Exactly. And in the last part, you mentioned this idea of the regulative use of reason when it comes to the idea of God.
Yeah.
And I have to admit, I'm really curious about that. So Kant is saying we can't know God through pure reason, but he's not saying God's not real, right?
Right. That's the thing about Kant. He always keeps us on our toes.
So how does that work? How can we even think about God if reason can't prove or disprove God's existence?
Well, that gets to the heart of Kant's philosophy of religion. He sees that even though we can't know God as an object, like we know a table or a chair,
Right.
the idea of God still has a really important role in our lives.
Okay, so maybe God isn't a thing we can prove exists out there in the universe, but the idea of God is still useful somehow.
Exactly. And that's what he means by the regulative use of reason.
So like it's a tool, a guiding principle.
Yeah, think of it this way. We can't know God directly, but the idea of God can help us make sense of things. It can unify our knowledge. It can help us strive for a coherent view of the world.
So maybe we can't say for sure God exists and prove it, but we can use the concept of God to understand our experience, to think about things like morality and purpose.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that reason has its limits, but it can still guide us toward a deeper understanding of ourselves and the universe.
This is reminding me of what we talked about before, how Kant says we can't know the universe as a whole, the thing in itself, but we can still study and understand the world as it appears to us.
That's a great connection. Kant's being consistent here. Reason has its powers, and it has its limits. We need to recognize both.
Okay.
When it comes to God, he's basically saying reason can't give us a definitive answer, but the idea of God can still be a kind of guide, a compass for our moral and intellectual pursuits.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. So for Kant, faith isn't about blindly believing something without evidence. It's more about,
More about recognizing the limits of reason.
yes, and seeing God as a source of meaning and moral guidance, even if we can't prove God exists scientifically.
Exactly. Kant wouldn't want you to check your brain at the door when it comes to faith. He sees it more as a rational commitment, a way of orienting ourselves in the world based on principles that go beyond what we can strictly prove.
This is really making me rethink the whole relationship between faith and reason. It's not an either thing for Kant.
Right, they can work together.
He's offering a much more sophisticated view of both faith and reason.
Definitely. He's not saying we should throw out reason and blindly embrace dogma, but he's saying there's more to human understanding than just logic and what we can observe.
I can see how Kant's ideas are still so relevant today, especially in a world where people are so often divided by their religious beliefs or lack of belief. His approach seems much more
Bridge building.
exactly. It encourages dialogue and respect between different ways of seeing the world. Even if we disagree about God, we can still agree on the importance of reason, morality, and trying to find meaning in life.
I think that's one of the most powerful aspects of Kant's philosophy, his ability to bring people together despite their differences.
Well, this deep dive has definitely lived up to its name. We've explored how Kant revolutionized our understanding of metaphysics, how he set limits on what we can know through pure reason, but also showed how reason can guide our scientific and moral inquiries. And he even gave us a new way to think about faith, not as the opposite of reason, but as something that can work alongside it.
It's been quite a journey, but remember, this is just the beginning of exploring Kant's thought. There's so much more out there to discover.
There really is. So to our listeners, thank you for joining us on this incredible deep dive. And keep those minds working, keep asking those big questions, and keep exploring the world of philosophy.